Hello and welcome to our podcast on the modes of nonfiction or documentary films. Let's go ahead and see what we're talking about. First of all, let's go ahead and review what a nonfiction film is. You will hear us use nonfiction and documentary film interchangeably. These are somewhat different from the fiction films or the feature films that you're probably used to seeing. Feature films are those that you see at the AMC. You go out on a Friday night, you're probably going to see a feature or a fiction film, meaning that the story is created from fiction. There may be historical or factual truths in them, but for the most part, the stories are more fictionalized than not. And these are certainly different from documentary films, where the filmmakers are trying to tell the story of something true, to expose the facts of a certain situation or a subject. And certainly there are overlaps and blurry lines between these two types of films, but for the most part, nonfiction films tend to be more real, kind of telling the truth about a topic, teaching us something, or their attempt to record real life. And so the goals of nonfiction film kind of came about from the early days. And so the first films that were made were documentary films. They just documented what the filmmakers saw. They weren't really creating stories with these quite yet. The story just kind of evolved from what they took footage of. So for example, the early films of women leaving a factory or Frank Ott's sneeze from the Edison studios, they just documented what they could with this new technology called movie cameras. And so you get John Grierson, a British filmmaker, felt that cinema could be more real if you just film reality. So he sought to tell the true story of coal miners in Great Britain and thought that that would be an interesting tale to tell. And it was, but it was very much documentary based. Dziga Vertov, Russian filmmaker, thought that life should be captured just as is. And Pare Lorenz, a documentary is a factual film which is dramatic. So trying to capture the story that is real life rather than concocting or making some fictional story, these guys' views were just that real life is a story. So let's just capture real life and keep an eye on the dramatic arc of reality. But as storytelling techniques evolved in the history of film and new technologies came about, we have more overlaps in documentary filmmaking with those storytelling devices that were being created in the fiction film world. So the idea of reenactment, the idea of cinematic lighting or musical additions. So we start to get some blurry lines between what is truly just reality, say perhaps like the Zapruder film, where you just have a guy filming a parade and oh my goodness, the president gets shot. There's no musical overlay, there's no editing done, there's no fancy camera work. It's just him taping reality. Then you get the evolution, you get some other things like Michael Moore, Food Inc., Murderball, The Cove, Thin Blue Line, documentaries like that are based in fact and in truth, have many overlaps with the feature film world. Again, the original goal is to talk about reality, to tell a story, to tell truth, but we start to have other elements getting in the way of that, and these are called the modes of documentary filmmaking. One last thing we need to talk about before we get into the modes is that every text has a bias, a perspective, a point of view. And since these are films that are created by human beings, we as human beings tend to put our bias into our work. As much as we may want to show the objective truth of something, many of these processed documentary films have a bias in them. Sometimes the bias is very slight. It is pretty much close to just the truth of a situation. Other times they're very one-sided. Perhaps a Michael Moore film, very one-sided against George W. Bush and Fahrenheit 9/11. He doesn't hide that at all. It is based in truth. It is trying to tell a real story, but he has added so many elements that it is more a Michael Moore biased film than it is documentary, although its heart is still trying to tell and show truth. So we need to think of this continuum that somewhere in the middle would be absolute truth, which I don't know if we can even capture, because as soon as we start editing something, we as humans are adding our bias. Why do we choose to cut out this and not that? That is adding our bias. And then to both ends of the spectrum, you have more addition of bias. Could be for or against the topic, making something look serious, making something look funny, something like that. And so as we think about this, everybody has a story to tell. And so documentary filmmakers are choosing to tell their story about the world through something they see as more objective, more full of truth. All of these modes that you're going to see in the next couple slides are methods that these filmmakers try to use to make their film feel or seem the most true and the most unbiased. But at the root of all this, we have to remember, since humans are biased, humans are making these films, all of these films have a bias. But how much of that is there is what we have to sift through as concerted watchers of film. So our first mode of documentary filmmaking is what we call the expository mode. This is where the filmmaker seeks to just explain a topic to the audience. It could be something historical, something based in nature, something political. They just try to tell the story of something. And oftentimes they do this through what we call direct address. There is some sort of narrator on screen, perhaps as in a Morgan Spurlock type movie, where he says, "This is what I did." It could be an off-screen narrator, this idea of a voice of God narrator, perhaps like a Ken Burns documentary about the Civil War, baseball, or jazz music, where you're seeing images that are showing you the history of the Civil War, but then you're hearing this voice. You don't see that person, you just hear it. And so we are told what to think, feel, and believe about these images because the narrator is telling that to us. Similar to that is the idea of an indirect address expository film. And so it's expository in that the filmmakers want us to think, feel, and believe a pretty certain thing, but the indirect address nature about it is that there is no narrator telling us what to think. We are kind of left to our own devices. For example, the movies of Cronus or Baraka or the Qatsi series may be seen as indirect address, where these movies are just images and sound. There is no text. There is no narrator telling us what to make of these. We are left to our own devices to interpret the text. But there's a kind of narrow field in which you can interpret those with. You can't say, oh yeah, this is totally about fill in the blank. No, they want you to get to a certain answer. They want you to get to it's a commentary about society. And if you're interpreting something way outside of society, you're missing their address. You're missing the indirect nature of it. So the second mode would be that which we call observational mode. This is a really interesting feeling of a mode. It's the idea of just kind of being there. They call it the fly on the wall. So what if the filmmaker just set up a camera and just filmed reality without interacting with it, without telling you what to think, feel, or believe, with minimal cutaways to other things, little use of soundtrack, non-diegetic sound? This might be what the observational mode feels like. Again, in their attempt to show reality, they're trying to just put forth a text that says, hey, here's a camera, and it's just watching. It's not manipulating. It's not forcing the subjects to change in any way. It's just observing. It's just watching. So this is often called direct cinema, and the idea is the camera just watches. It feels real because nobody's there. We're just watching people, and therefore if we're just watching them, we're not manipulating in any way. It just feels super real. It just feels like truth. The third mode we talk about is what's called the interactive mode. And this is where the filmmaker, him or herself, gets involved in the making of the film in front of the camera. So for example, in a feature film like Schindler's List, you know Steven Spielberg is in charge of this thing, but he's not going to come around the camera and tell you what to believe. He's not going to come around the camera and interact with the actors as he tries to create Auschwitz. He's going to stay behind. That's a feature film technique. But a documentary film technique might be that the filmmaker comes around the camera and does interviews in front of you, that he asks his subjects questions, that he, like Morgan Spurlock, actually is the subject, that he comes around the camera and you see him eating the 30 days of McDonald's, you see him feeling sick, you see him going to the doctor and getting the physical. You can see a Michael Moore in Fahrenheit 9/11 approaching congressmen and speaking with them about their thoughts on the Iraq War. That feels different from an observational mode where the camera's just sitting there watching people. Here, it's almost like the filmmaker is kind of antagonizing the subject, saying, oh yeah, this is what you think, but this is what I think. And that's somewhat real too. That's how we live. We ask people questions, we hear their responses, we debate them a little bit. And so some filmmakers choose to work in this interactive mode in order to create a more true feeling to their film. The fourth mode we talk about is relatively obscure and it's hard to describe. It's easier to see it than to truly just hear it through words. But that fourth mode is what we call the reflexive mode. It is a film that is aware of itself as a film. So documentaries that show the idea of filmmaking itself might be seen as reflexive. So one example of a film that has some reflexive elements might be that of Vertov's Man with a Movie Camera. So while 90% of that film just kind of watches and observes a day in Russia or days in Russia, there are elements of that film where they have included the actual filmmaking process itself. So you can see Vertov like making the film. You can see him editing certain things and struggling with which scenes to choose. And so it's kind of weird again, because the film is aware of itself as a film. Like, it's not trying to say this is exactly what Russia looked like at this time. It's showing you this is what Russia looked like at the time, and this is how we made the film about that day. It's a film that's kind of about filmmaking, and so it has a little bit of reflexivity in it. But truly, most documentaries that we're going to watch are a mix of modes. We probably aren't going to watch too many that are strictly observational, because they feel slow. They feel like you're just sitting there watching people do stuff, and it's kind of weird and creepy. Most of the films that you guys are aware of have a mix in them. And so our task as studiers of film is to say, A, what mode is going on in front of me right now? How does each mode feel? And which one feels the most real about this subject? Which is more toward the middle of that spectrum, that is more toward absolute truth versus the exceptionally biased views through other modes. We can't truly capture absolute truth because there are humans involved. We put our biases in there. Every time we make an edit, we are revealing a bias. But some of these feel more real than others. So if we can remember what these modes are and kind of put that together with our own critical thinking, we can look at it and say, yeah, this feels more real, or oh my goodness, this feels exceptionally biased for or against a topic. So that's it in terms of the modes of nonfiction films. I think if we focus on those four, we have a good start to dissecting how documentary films work, how they feel, how they seek to capture reality, how some of them succeed in really doing that, and how others become a little bit more biased in their nature. So as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to bring those into class. We'll get those answered for you. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon.